Russell's tires were not supposed to survive like that. Not while pushing. Not while defending. Not while keeping the pace alive. Because in Formula 1, speed always has a price. Push harder, and the tires overheat. Slide more, and the grip disappears. Attack too long, and the race comes back to punish you. But Russell's Mercedes looked like it had found a way to escape the punishment. The tires stayed calm. The rear stayed stable. The lap time stayed there. And when the secret thermal trick leaked, the entire paddock started asking the same terrifying question. Was Russell saving the tires, or was the W17 saving them for him? Because if Mercedes used heat to protect tire life, that is not just clever. That is race control. And if the system crossed the line, the FIA has a scandal. But if it was legal, rivals have an even bigger nightmare. Mercedes may have found a way to attack without destroying the tires, and in Formula 1, that is the kind of advantage that does not just win races. It changes championships. Subscribe to the channel. At first, Mercedes could explain everything with one word. Management. Russell managed the tires. Russell understood the grip. Russell drove smoothly. Russell knew when to attack, when to protect, when to breathe on the throttle, and when to let the car come back to him. That is the story Mercedes would want everyone to believe. And it is not impossible. Great drivers do this all the time. They make tire life look simple when it is actually one of the hardest skills in racing. They feel the rear axle before the data confirms it. They know when the tire surface is starting to overheat. They sense the moment the car begins to slide just a little too much. They protect the rubber before the damage becomes visible. Russell is good enough to do that. But this is where the controversy begins. Because the question was not whether Russell could manage tires. The question was whether any driver could manage tires like that, while still keeping that pace. That is the detail rivals could not ignore. A driver can save tires by slowing down. That is normal. Brake earlier. Turn more gently. Delay the throttle. Avoid fighting the rear. Stop asking the tire for too much. Every driver on the grid understands that trade. Protect the rubber now, give up lap time now, hope to gain it back later. But Russell's Mercedes appeared to challenge that trade. The pace stayed strong. The rear stayed calm. The degradation did not arrive the way rivals expected. And suddenly, the paddock had to ask a much darker question. Was Russell managing the tires, or had Mercedes built a car that made management easier than it should have been? That is the difference between skill and system. Skill is the driver doing something extraordinary with the same limits as everyone else. A system is the car changing those limits before the driver even begins. And in Formula 1, that difference is everything. Because tire degradation is not just about the tires. It is the final visible result of the whole car. The power delivery. The aero balance. The rear suspension. The cooling layout. The brake temperatures. The engine behavior. The way the car puts energy into the rubber. The way the rear tires are loaded when Russell comes back on throttle. All of it writes itself into the degradation curve. So when the degradation looks unusual, engineers do not only blame or praise the driver. They follow the chain. They ask where the heat came from. They ask where the heat went. They ask why the tire surface stayed calmer. They ask why the rear axle did not slide more. They ask why the car could keep producing lap time without tearing the rubber apart. And this is where the leaked thermal trick becomes the center of the story. Because heat is the invisible enemy behind tire degradation. Not the only enemy, but the one that turns a strong stint into a collapsing stint faster than almost anything else. When the rear tires get too hot, the surface starts to lose grip. When the surface loses grip, the car slides. When the car slides, the tire gets even hotter. Then the grip drops again. Then the driver slides more. And once that spiral begins, the stint can fall apart in a handful of laps. That is the nightmare every team is trying to avoid. And if Mercedes found a way to slow that spiral, then Russell's performance starts to make more sense. Not because the tires were magical. Not because Russell never pushed. Not because degradation disappeared completely. But because the W17 may have been hurting the tires less while still creating competitive pace. That is the holy grail. Speed without collapse. Attack without immediate punishment. Pressure without destroying the rear. And that is exactly why rivals would demand answers. Because a car that protects its tires does not only gain lap time. It gains strategic control. It can stay out longer. It can force rivals to pit earlier. It can hold pressure without burning through the rubber. It can wait until the other driver's tires begin to fade. It can make the race come toward it, instead of chasing the race desperately. That is why tire life is one of the most powerful advantages in Formula 1. It is quiet. It is not as obvious as a top speed advantage. It does not always appear in the first 3 laps. But when the stint reaches the moment where everyone expects the drop, the car with better tire life suddenly becomes terrifying. Because it still has grip. It still has traction. It still has choices. And choices win races. That may be what made Russell's Mercedes look so dangerous. Not one spectacular moment. Not one impossible overtake. But the absence of the usual decline. The tires were supposed to start complaining. The rear was supposed to become more nervous. The lap times were supposed to bleed away. The car was supposed to pay the price for earlier pace. But the price looked smaller than expected. And in Formula 1, when the price of speed becomes smaller, every rival starts looking for the hidden discount. That hidden discount may have been thermal. Because if the W17 controlled heat better, then every connected system benefits. The power unit can operate more consistently. The bodywork can remain tighter. The airflow over the rear of the car can stay cleaner. The rear tires can avoid being overworked by instability. The driver can apply throttle with more confidence. The car slides less. The tires heat less. The degradation curve stays flatter. That is the chain rivals fear. Cooling leads to packaging. Packaging leads to airflow. Airflow leads to rear stability. Rear stability leads to cleaner traction. Cleaner traction leads to lower tire stress. Lower tire stress leads to longer pace. And longer pace leads to control. That is why the secret thermal trick matters so much. It does not need to touch the tires directly to change their life. It only needs to change the conditions around them. That is what makes the concept so hard to police. If there were a visible device aimed at the tires, rivals could point at it. If there were an obvious illegal component, the FIA could remove it. But if the advantage is created by how the entire car manages temperature, airflow, and power delivery together, the answer becomes far more complicated. Mercedes can say the car is simply efficient. Rivals can say the effect is too powerful to ignore. The FIA has to decide whether the rules are measuring the right thing. And the fans are left asking why Russell's tires looked so different. That is the problem with thermal advantages. They do not always look like devices. They look like behavior. A calmer rear. A smoother traction phase. A healthier degradation curve. A car that does not fade when everyone expects it to. A driver who seems to have more margin than the others. That is why the leak trick became so important. It gave the behavior a possible explanation. Before the leak, Russell's tire life could be described as great management. After the leak, people began asking whether the management was being helped by something deeper in the W17. Something hidden. Something temperature-based. Something that made the car easier on its tires by design. And that is the most dangerous kind of advantage, because it protects the driver from the usual consequences. A driver in a nervous car must constantly correct. Each correction costs tire life. A driver in a stable car can be gentle without being slow. That is the difference. Russell did not need the car to remove degradation entirely. He only needed it to reduce the moments that create degradation. Less wheel spin. Less sliding. Less overheating. Less panic from the rear axle. Less punishment when he returned to throttle. Over a single corner, that may seem small. Over a full stint, it becomes enormous. Because tire degradation is cumulative. Damage builds. Heat builds. Small slides become bigger losses later. A tiny improvement repeated again and again becomes a race-changing advantage. That is why Austria, with its repeated traction zones and heavy braking demands, would make the suspicion even louder. A track like that tests the rear tires constantly. It asks the car to slow down hard, rotate, and accelerate again. It punishes poor traction. It punishes instability. It punishes overheating. And because the lap is short, the same stress comes back quickly. Again. 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 If a car is weak thermally, Austria exposes it. If a car protects its rear tires, Austria rewards it. So if Russell's Mercedes looked like it could keep the tires alive there, rivals would not call it luck. They would call it evidence of a pattern. Not proof of illegality. But a pattern that demands explanation. That is how Formula 1 investigations begin. Not always with a smoking gun. Often with a performance trace that does not match expectations. A tire curve that is too strong. A speed profile that holds too long. A degradation phase that arrives too late. A driver who can push at moments where the models say he should be managing. Teams notice those details instantly. They compare them to their own cars. They compare them to fuel load. They compare them to track temperature. They compare them to traffic. They compare them to tire age. And if the Mercedes still looks abnormal, the question becomes unavoidable. What is helping Russell? That is where Mercedes would be under pressure. Because once a thermal trick is linked to tire life, every explanation becomes more difficult. If they say it is the driver, rivals ask why the car makes the driver look so protected. If they say it is setup, rivals ask why the setup does not cost speed elsewhere. If they say it is cooling efficiency, rivals ask whether the cooling system is creating an effect the regulations allow. If they say it is all legal, rivals ask the FIA to prove the test is capturing the racing condition. That last part is critical. Because Formula 1 cars are not static. They change when they heat up. They change when loaded. They change when the driver pushes. They change when airflow and temperature interact. A car that looks one way in the garage can behave differently after 10 laps under stress. That is not unusual. It is the nature of the sport. But if a team designs that transformation deliberately, and that transformation gives a major tire advantage, then the FIA has to decide where the legal line sits. Is it natural behavior? Is it clever optimization? Is it a loophole? Or is it illegal? That is why the story becomes so intense. Because the answer may not be obvious. The most controversial Formula 1 ideas often live in the gray area first. Rivals call them unfair. The team calls them innovation. The FIA studies the wording. The media turns the uncertainty into a storm. And the stopwatch keeps counting. That is the part rivals hate most. While everyone debates, Mercedes still races. While the FIA examines, the points already scored remain valuable. While rivals try to understand the concept, Russell keeps learning how to use the car. And if the advantage is real, every race before clarity becomes expensive. That is why the phrase, "Russell's tires never degraded," is so powerful. It exaggerates the feeling rivals had watching the car. Of course tires always degrade. Every tire degrades. But the shock was that the Mercedes appeared to degrade less than expected, in the moments when the race should have become harder. And that is enough to create panic. Because a car with lower degradation does not need to dominate qualifying every weekend. It can win by being patient. It can win by staying alive. It can win when the fastest car on lap 1 becomes vulnerable on lap 20. It can win when rivals burn through their tires trying to escape. That kind of car is brutal. It makes everyone else race against the future. Push now, and suffer later. Save now, and lose track position. There is no comfortable answer. That is what Russell may have had. A car that gave him more comfortable answers than everyone else. And the leaked thermal trick may explain why. Because if the W17 kept the rear tires inside a cleaner thermal range, Russell did not have to choose between pace and protection as severely. He could attack in a way that looked sustainable. He could hold lap time without triggering the same temperature spike. He could force rivals into the degradation spiral while staying just outside it himself. That is the kind of edge that changes the psychological rhythm of a race. The rival waits for Russell to fade. Russell does not fade enough. The rival pushes harder. The rival overheats. Russell stays there. The pit wall gets nervous. The strategy window shifts. The race begins to tilt. That is how a hidden thermal concept can become visible through tires. Not because anyone sees the system. Because they see what the system prevents. The rear tires do not fall away as quickly. The car does not slide as much. The lap time does not disappear. The driver does not sound as desperate. Sometimes, the most revealing evidence in Formula 1 is not what happens. It is what fails to happen. The expected collapse does not come. The expected degradation does not arrive. The expected Mercedes weakness stays hidden. And that absence becomes the clue. That is what rivals would obsess over. They would not only watch Russell's fastest laps. They would watch the slow loss. How much pace disappeared from lap to lap. How the tires behaved after pressure. Whether the rear degradation matched the energy being put through the car. Whether the Mercedes was creating less thermal damage than the lap time suggested. That kind of analysis is brutal. It can expose whether a car is truly gentle, or whether the driver is simply hiding the problem. And if the data showed Russell still strong when the tires should have been hurting, the leak would suddenly feel much more believable. But Mercedes would still have a defense. And it would be a strong one. They would say Formula 1 is about making the car efficient. They would say temperature control is not suspicious by itself. They would say every team is trying to reduce tire degradation. They would say Russell's driving, setup, and car balance created the advantage legally. They would say rivals are angry because they did not find the same performance. That argument cannot be dismissed. Because not every unusual advantage is illegal. Sometimes, one team simply understands the problem better. And if Mercedes understood how to manage heat better than anyone else, then rivals are not looking at cheating.